this, I'll also put my notes into the chat so people can see what I'm doing. Now let me just try and okay. Right. So thinking about John Wesley's understanding of the church and the unity of the church, perhaps just to take a step back and to look at some broader issues in ecumenical theology. In the past 125 years odd, since the rise of the modern ecumenical movement, there have been a number of emphases in ecumenical theology. The first great meeting was the meeting of the International Mission Conference in 1910 in Edinburgh. And there the focus very much was on unity in mission. Maybe we can't agree on everything else, but at least we can be united in our efforts at that stage in a very kind of evangelistic understanding of mission in proclaiming Christ to the world. Out of that conference, a number of things flowed. One of which was an emphasis to try what does it mean? Yes, it's fine to have been mission oriented, but what about the kind of theological and polity issues that we face? How do we understand what the role of a bishop is, or what baptism is legitimate, and so on? And that grew out of that became a movement on faith and order, which is the first major conference in 1927, the World Conference on Faith and Order. A second movement that came out of that was, it's really great to get to know each other, but how can we actually use this and develop this friendships, relationships as a contribution to world peace? And out of that came the World Alliance for Promoting Friendship Among Churches. Ironically, the first meeting was in 1914 in Lake Constance in Germany, and the meeting had to be broken up, and the delegates were then traveling by train, of course, no planes, to the nearest port to get back to where they were coming from, because the various world powers were mobilizing their forces. And they got special permission. They were the last trains out of Germany before the First World War. It picked up again in 1919 and continued to be a significant movement of building relationships, particularly during the time between the two world wars. Related movement emphasized unity through social engagement. That's the World Conference on Faith and Work, first meeting in 1925, and eventually establishes the Ecumenical Council of Life and Work. So it should be life and work, not faith and work. We'll come to life and work. So. And then finally, to jump a few decades later, is a new emphasis. The other movements virtually all merged into what became the World Council of Churches. But what was discovered particularly in the 70s and 80s is that while these things are all nice, the practical realities are much more complicated. The struggle to find unity in mission stumbled in the 70s and 80s because they had radically different understandings of what mission meant. Doctrine and polity, we had some high points and some low points. That continues that work around the church, the baptism, Eucharist, and ministry document, and so on. The peace building element, well, we know where we are in the world today. And social engagement, faith and work, life and work. The problem there was, again, what kind of social engagement should we be involved in? And the differences were there almost as stark as anywhere else. And in the beginning of this millennium, there was a new movement to say, well, let's focus on our shared experience of Christ, differently expressed, differently understood, differently interpreted. But what would happen if you got leaders together from diverse Christian communions who could share their experience of faith? Could we come to a new understanding sharing that? So that's a kind of another model, of what unity is about. These are not separate, they're not divided, but there are different ways, focus, emphases. And so I want to think about Wesley in terms of these different models. But what I've come to understand, particularly in the recent years since I finished those two books, was how central the unity of the church is to Wesley. And I know that it was present throughout his writings, but it really is central to that. And I think to help us understand that, I I want to sketch out what I call the grand narrative of salvation in Wesley's writings. Just for those who are Wesley, know a little bit around Wesley, the focus on Wesley's writings in books on the theology of Wesley is often about what's sometimes referred to as the way of salvation or the order of salvation. Sin, prevenient grace, repentance, justification by faith, the new birth, sanctification, entire sanctification, the kind of steps of personal salvation. And that's true, that's in the foreground of what Wesley writes, but in the background is actually a broader understanding of what God is doing in the world. And I've come increasingly to see that this picture of the way of salvation must be seen against that background of the broader picture of what God is doing in the world. And when we begin to see that, we see how crucial the unity of the church is in Wesley's thinking. So we start off with human beings created in the image of the God of love. That is, we created as social beings who love God. Sorry, that something went strange wrong. Typo. Who love God. Sorry, this is really. Human beings created in the image of God. As we created as social beings to love God and to love our fellow human beings and to care for creation. I will rewrite that when I send out the notes. The second point is that this is disrupted, and the essence of disruption is love turning into its opposite, resulting in a whole sphere of alienation, conflict, injustice, cruelty, indifference, faithlessness, betrayal, deceit, deception, violence. And Wesley paints some really duster pictures of this world. And for Wesley, these are the characteristics and the prime work of Satan and his demonic forces. I don't know how much we want to go into Wesley's demonology, but he sees this as the key element of what is evil. The disruption of love, alienation, conflict, injury, cruelty, indifference, faithlessness, betrayal, deceit, deception, violence. As a consequence of the fall, human beings and human societies take on some of these characteristics. Wesley is quite dramatic. He talks about turning from being in the image of God to being in the image of the devil. And it's really kind of dramatic. But he's saying our human lives take on these characteristics, these evil characteristics, which are the opposite of love. But importantly, Wesley doesn't leave us there, because God in prevenient grace counteracts the demonic influences, partially restores the divine image in humanity, enabling human beings and societies to manifest aspects of love, of justice, of compassion, of truth, of faithfulness, of peace. So that's the kind of duster background when Wesley talks about salvation. And then he comes to talk about salvation. And that it is in Christ, active presence of the Spirit. God's reign of love has erupted into history to overcome the demonic forces and their influence. So Wesley describes the mission of Christ as to destroy the works of the devil through the transformation of human beings who have faith in Christ and are brought into communion with the triune God and with all others in communion with God. Each of these pieces could be explored more, and I don't have a lot of time, so I won't do that. But importantly is that in Christ, this demonic tendency away from love to do the opposite of love is turned back, so that human beings can be transformed as we come into union, as communion with God, the triune God, and in communion with others in communion with God. Again, important to see this because it's not always present in the foreground of what Wesley is saying, but it's there in the background. Believers are forgiven, we're justified, we are transformed, restoring the image of the God of love within them. And this is manifested in a life of love for God and their fellow human beings. Sorry, I realize here I've made lots of typos in this presentation. Apologies. I will rework it. I was too asleep this morning when I was writing it. So believers are forgiven and transformed. The image of God is restored. The God of love is restored, manifesting a life of love to God and our fellow human beings. And this is the foretaste of the eschatological new creation. Wesley talks about a taste of the world to come. Charles Wesley talks about the experience of heaven now. Sanctification for Wesley is growth in love, so that love permeates the whole of a person's life, expressed in justice, mercy, compassion, truth, faithfulness, and peacemaking. And then growth in love reaches new depth, breadth, pervasiveness, and intensity in Christian perfection or entire sanctification. Okay, so that's in mind, this personal transformation. This is what God does in the human person, but that is not left in the human person. It's not individualistic. It impacts the life, society, the world. And one way is that Wesley talks about the universal or invisible church. That is the communion of all who live in communion with God through Jesus Christ. And this invisible church takes form, visible form, in communities of Christians on earth. And just bear this whole thing, this in mind. What makes the person the Christian is they've been transformed so that they love God and love their neighbors. These are the communities of people who love each other. So these are the communities or places where Christians grow in, experience, and express love for God, love for each other, and all human beings as integral parts of creation. That's what I try to get through in the book, Our Purpose is Love. That the church is about love. We miss the point if we think it's about something else. So the defining characteristics of these communities is love. It's love. It's not correct doctrine or church order, which determines whether a community that claims to be a church is an authentic expression of the invisible church. Wesley in his day would have signed the Articles of Religion of the Church of England, which is, and the article on the church is very similar to the one we have in our Methodist articles, which defines the visible church as a community of faithful people who, where the word is faithfully preached and the sacraments are faithfully administered. I'm quoting from it. It's not the exact wording. And it's very interesting. In Wesley's time, when he was a young missionary in America, some of his friends who were German pietists wanted to celebrate communion with him, and he refused to offer them to celebrate communion because he said their baptism was not legitimate because the person who had baptized them hadn't been ordained by a bishop in the apostolic succession. Now, those who know some of our discussions with the Episcopal Church, this might sound interesting. Sometime later, in the 40s, Wesley writes a number of pieces, one of which is a book called An Appeal to Men of Reason and Religion, in which he articulates the same idea that the sacraments are important, and the right preaching of the word. Perhaps just take a step back. This definition of the church goes back to the Confessio Augustina, the Lutheran confession from the Reformation, and it's basically designed to exclude Catholics, because according to Luther, they don't teach they don't preach the word properly, and they don't celebrate the sacraments properly. And so Wesley repeats this in Appeal to Men of Reason and Religion and some of his other writings at the time. And he basically says we've got to hold to this because otherwise we have to include the Quakers in the church. We really want to include the Quakers. But slowly his thinking develops, and so by the time he comes in the 1870s to write his sermon on the church, he says, that the church is made up of faithful people, affirms that strongly, the visible church. But he says about the sacraments and preaching the word, he says, well, won't really insist upon that. Because there are people who are genuinely Christians, who genuinely meet as churches, who, in my opinion, don't preach the word correctly. They don't preach justification by faith as they should do, and they don't celebrate the sacraments correctly. They're Baptists or something like that. So he comes to a point where he drops that point, the theological and the doctrinal and the sacramental elements as visible marks of the church, and the focus becomes on faithful people. And of course, what Wesley means by faithful people, people who are holy, people whose life is permeated by God's love. So love is the only genuine mark. So love is only genuine when it is concretely expressed in unity and community with each other. The greater the love, the greater the unity. And what I think has really I've come to see recently is that this unity is multidimensional. It's not just about being ecumenical relationships in a narrow sense of the word. It's about peacemaking, struggling to work for peace within communities. It's about caring for each other. It's about sharing material possessions. It's striking throughout Wesley's writings. He goes back to that story in Acts where the early church sold their property and gave the produce, the money earned to the poor. And he comes back time and time again to see this as a kind of normative expression of Christian love, and that ultimately in the millennium, when the church is perfect again, it will do the practices. Now, whatever we think about that that in terms of our contemporary context, the importance he's saying is being one with each other is not just about being nice to each other. It's not just about agreeing to share sacraments with each other. It's not just about sharing ministries with each other. It's about practical engagement. It's about caring for each other. It's about materially, physically caring for each other. So it's another. So ecumenacy has a very practical dimension for Wesley. Okay. So where do we go from there? That's the background. Now, how does this work out in practice in terms of the kinds of things we're talking about ecumenical relationships? Firstly, let's sketch. I'm sure we're all aware of the historical background. Methodism in Wesley's time is not a church. It does become towards the end of his life a separate church in the US, but at this stage it's a movement, a renewal movement within the Church of England. The big debates are, how does this renewal movement relate to the structures of the Church of England? Should it leave the church and become a separate church or not? And also, how does this movement relate to other renewal movements in the Church of England? How does it relate to people who are members of the Church of England but who are not part of the renewal movement, particularly the bishops? And should people who are Methodist also go to communion in the Church of England, the local parish church, which Wesley insists upon? And people come back and say, no, but the priest there doesn't preach the gospel properly. How can we celebrate communion with the priest's theology is all wrong? So that's the key issue. And then what also is beginning to happen is people from outside the Church of England, Baptists, Presbyterians, and others, also join Wesleyan Methodist societies. And so you've got people who are, and Wesley explicitly says, Methodist societies, yes, we are a new movement in the Church of England. We don't want to withdraw from the Church of England, but we are open to all. And he says that's the pride, that's the criteria, that is the glory of Methodism, is that we're open to all. So, what are then other foundations of Wesley's understanding of ecumenicity? The first, and this might seem straight, I keep coming back to this, that salvation is personal transformation by the active presence of the Spirit. This is the core that everything revolves around in terms of Wesley's theology. Keeps coming back to it. The second is that we are fallible and limited creatures. And salvation and sanctification and the power of the Spirit doesn't change that. We have physical, mental limitations. We cannot know everything. We cannot understand who God is and what God wants. We cannot fully understand what God reveals in the scriptures and in Jesus Christ. Our abilities are just purely physical abilities are limited. We stand with particular educational backgrounds, particular cultural backgrounds, particularly educational backgrounds, that limits and shapes what we can know. And we are fallible. We make mistakes. We misunderstand things. No matter how good and how deep we study a subject, we are subject to mistakes and errors. That's normal for human beings on this earth at this time. And that's not going to change until the resurrection for Wesley. We will always be fallible. We are called to strive, Wesley argued, to know the truth, to have the best possible comprehension of life and of the world around us and of God and of the truths that God reveals. But we will never achieve it. And no matter how much we strive, we always need to recognize that our most deeply held opinions might be wrong. And the question is not, are we wrong? The question is just, where are we wrong? And if we're genuine to say, yes, I know, even though I think I'm right, it's always possible that I might be wrong. I just don't know where I am wrong. And that's key to when Wesley begins to think about theology and doctrine. The next point is that doctrine is not some kind of infallible teaching. Doctrine, even doctrine hallowed in the creeds, the Nicene Creed, etc., is not infallible doctrine. Not only do we as individuals mess up and are fallible and have limitations, but the church is fallible and has limitations and is mixed up. So doctrine is always a human description of God's transforming action and subject to all the limitations of humanity. It is never something that drops revealed, on the mountaintop somewhere, drops from heaven. All our doctrine, even the most precious central cores of our doctrine, are human descriptions of God's transforming action. So Wesley writes, he puts forward his sermons and his notes upon the New Testament as standards of doctrine. And in the preface to them, he says, I'm fallible, essentially. If you find errors in these, please come back to me and criticize me. We've kind of lost that in the Methodist Church, the tradition. We don't have in front of our standards of doctrine, these could be mistaken, please come and correct them. No, we put all clauses rather than that they can't be changed. That's really not very Wesleyan. Because Wesley was saying, even the most hallowed forms of doctrine might be changed. And that's what he did. I mean, Wesley did that. He took the 39 articles of the Church of England and he edited them and sent them to the church in America. And he left out key parts. One of which causes controversy to the present day is he left out the article about the creeds and the Nicene Creed. That's why we don't have the Nicene Creed as one of our doctrinal standards. It goes back to Wesley. Blame it on Wesley. So Wesley is saying all our doctrine are human attempts. The fourth point is divine justice and mercy. You might say, what on earth is that doing about ecumenism? Wesley argued that God is just and compassionate, that God understands what it means to be human, and God does not expect us to have perfect doctrine. God understands that we don't have perfect doctrine, and God will not hold us responsible for not having perfect doctrine. We mess up, and as he always argues, errors in doctrine lead to errors in practice. So the church is not going to be perfect. God does not expect the church to be perfect because God knows what human beings are. And we're always on a pilgrimage. We're always moving forward, but God doesn't expect us to be perfect. But what God does expect of us is to have a clear conscience, that we might seek to the best of our abilities to come to an understanding of what the truth is for us. We must reflect on Scripture, seek to understand the person of Jesus, seek to understand the tradition of the church, and come to an idea of what we think is true and just and good, how we should believe, what we should do. Wesley is not saying because doctrine is a human construction, it is of no value, or we can believe what we like. No, Wesley is saying it's a human construction, but we are responsible for God, what we believe and what we do. Therefore, we need to strive in company with others, in discussion with others, in learning from others to come to as best possible understanding of the truth and how we should live and act in this world. So it's not a free-for-all. He's not saying doctrine doesn't matter. He's not saying all doctrines are equal. Now, it doesn't matter whether you are a Christian or whether you believe that Christ was fully divine, fully human, or you just believe he was just human, or you believe in justification by faith, or you think of justification with faith plus works, or whatever. He says those things are important. So we need to strive before God to seek what is the truth. And the next foundation is the centrality of love, and the church as the embodiment of love. The others are kind of what I'm going to call epistemological, about the way we know things. This is about the church itself. So on the one hand, Wesley is affirming that human doctrine is a construct. We don't have perfect understanding. We are limited. It's fallible. That's all important. We've got to do it. We need to seek to describe, understand who God is and what God is doing in the world and how we participate in what God is doing in the world. That's very, very important. But the key point is love. The key point is not correct doctrine. The key point is not orthodoxy. The key point is not the way we celebrate the sacraments or our understanding of ministry. The key point is love, and that the church is to embody divine love. That's what it was there about. If you know, that sketched out that understanding the narrative of salvation. The key point is that God creates this community to be the place of love, not the place of truth, not the place of order, not the place of legal structures, but the place of love. And with that goes an understanding of humility as a manifestation of love. To love is to be humble. And humility means we recognize our own fallibility. Humility means we recognize our own limitations. Humility means we recognize when in the past we've done that which is not right. Humility also means the rejection of the use of power to coerce people to believe in particular ways. Again, important to remember Wesley's context. If you know the history of England in the 17th and 18th centuries, you know, there was the time of the Civil War in Britain, and the imposition of the Puritan imposition of their understanding of theology on the country, and then the restoration of the monarchy, in which case many pastors were thrown out. The pastors were required to affirm the Church of England prayer book, and many pastors refused to do that because they said they couldn't in good conscience. Among them, Wesley's two grandfathers, both of whom were thrown out of the ministry. And his one grandfather was imprisoned a number of times for illegal preaching. So for Wesley, it's part of his family history that coercion, attempts to coerce people to believe, really are disastrous. And he still has in the back of his mind the earlier part of the 17th, the end of the 16th century, where people were being burnt at the stake and killed and tortured for their faith and belief by other Christians. And so we're saying humility means we do not coerce people. And whether that coercion is physical torture, as it was at some stages, or threat of physical violence, or psychological pressure, or impositions of regulations that attempt to do that, to coerce people into believing certain ways, those need to be rejected. Now, I must say, Wesley is better in theory than he was in practice. Okay, Wesley did some coercive activity on his way, in his own way, but let's keep that in mind. Okay. So those are the kind of foundations of Wesley's understanding. Watching my time here. So how does this work out then in practice? The first thing, the core of Wesley's understanding or ecumenical understanding is a mutual recognition of the transforming experience of the Spirit. This he describes in his famous sermon, The Catholic Spirit, but comes across also in his other sermons, the sermon from the funeral for George Whitefield, and in numerous other writings. Wesley sees that we can recognize in other people the transforming work of the Spirit, even when we describe that transforming work very differently. And in his sermon on the righteousness of Christ, Christ our righteousness, he explains that in terms of the debates around the Reformation, around justification by faith, and all the language, the debates there. And his argument is part of what's going on there is we're describing the same experience, but using different language. This is again what comes up again in 20th century in the joint declaration on justification between the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics. Essentially saying the same thing. The same transforming work of the Spirit can be transformed in different language. And the problem comes when we emphasize the language by which we describe it, the doctrine, which is, in Wesley's understanding, a fallible human construct, instead of the actual work of what God is doing within us. So there needs to be this, and this is where this links up in a way with the work of Global Christian Forum, where you're saying we recognize in each other the transforming work of the Spirit, even though we describe that radically differently. The second area where he emphasizes is there's a mutual recognition of participation in God's mission of overcoming sin and evil in the human heart and in broader society. We see this in his sermon, A Caution Against Bigotry, which is a reflection on the story in the Gospels where the disciples come and complain because other people are casting out demons who are not part of their group. And Jesus famously says, those who are not against us are for us. And Wesley expounds on this, and he's saying, where we see God using people to cast out demons, and he interprets this casting out demons very broadly as overcoming the effect of evil, particularly in the human heart, but we see in his other writings it's brought into human society as well. So where we see God using people to bring about transformation, to overcome sin and evil, we can recognize within them the Spirit at work, even though we have very major theological and even religious differences with him. One of the remarkable pieces in this, the sermon, A Caution Against Bigotry, is he says we are bigots if we rule out in advance that a Turk, in other words, a Muslim, could be casting out demons, or a I can't think of it, the other term. One of the Christological heresies. They could be casting out demons. In other words, he's saying these people might have radically different theological, doctrinal, and even religious views, but maybe they're still participating in God's mission in the world. If we see them bringing about radical transformation, or God using them to bring about radical transformation, which overcomes sin, where people are transformed so that they love God and each other, and that impacts their life in society. If we see that happening, we can recognize God is at work in them and through them. And then he says we mustn't restrict them. Now, some of the things he's reacting to is the way the Church of England tried to restrict the Methodist preachers. But he's taking the point that if we see God at work in these people, we mustn't restrict them. We must support them. We must encourage them. We might continue to pray for them. So he's saying, where we see God at work, let us do our best to support that God's people in God, even when we have radical differences. So, secondly, there's also mutual recognition, even when there's disagreement on praxis, on issues with the issues of church order, or even on ethical issues. Can we recognize God at work in people even when we disagree? In other words, we recognize people's genuine love for God and for other people, even when we disagree with how that is sometimes manifested and worked out. There's an interesting example of this in Wesley's writings, where his commentary on Acts, the council in Jerusalem, where there was this big discussion about how Jews and Gentiles, whether or not they should, what were the qualifications for Gentiles to be part of the church. And there's a letter sent out. And amongst other things in this letter, there's one point which people tend to forget, is it says that the Gentiles shouldn't eat meat that has blood in it. One of the kosher requirements. And Wesley comments that this was practiced in the early church, that in the early church people didn't eat meat with blood in it. It was only later, in Wesley's opinion, due to the intervention of a pope, that people began to eat meat that hadn't been slaughtered in the kosher way. And he argues that this should be normative into the present time, that Christians shouldn't eat meat, because he traces that back to Noah and the laws given to Noah. He says this precedes the giving of the law to Moses, and this shouldn't be a characteristic. And he strongly emphasizes this is scriptural, this is biblical. It was just a pope who changed it, which for Wesley is a bad idea. If a pope changes things, it's not. We don't really need to listen to the pope. But there's a letter sometime later where he writes to one of his correspondents who had been who disagreed with him on this issue, and had been excluded from a religious society because he was prepared to eat meat which had blood in it. And Wesley is very upset about this and says, how can this be that you're excluded for this minor reason? So he affirms this thing is biblical and goes back to Noah, but says it's not really that important. So we can disagree on practice, we still need to live with each other. There's mutual recognition of the fallibility of human doctrinal descriptions of divine, salvific activity, human personal and ecclesial responses. If we're going to be one, we need to recognize the fallibility of our doctrinal descriptions and of our human personal ecclesial responses. In other words, our church order, the way we do things. Wesley is strong and says we need to recognize that these are fallible. They are not divinely given to us. And therefore, they're always subject to change. They're always subject to adaptation, and they always need to be recognized as fallible and not treated then as obstacles to unity. And the final point I want to note here is that there's the grading of theological and ethical positions in relationship to the center of God's transforming human beings so that they can live lives of love. This is both theological and ethical. Theological, you'll say there are certain things which are really important, and he emphasizes the doctrines of original sin, repentance, faith, justification, sanctification. He says these are essential. Why? Because they focus on the change that God works in the human life. But they're not essential. They're like all other things, they are human descriptions. But he says they are more important than, say, the details of the doctrine of the Trinity. So when he's in his sermon on the Trinity, he emphasizes that God is one and God is three, and he says that's the essentials. Everything else we shouldn't insist upon. So he talks about the so-called Athanasian Creed and says, I agree with all this detail, but it's not essential. This can't be a point of division between us, because the core is God is three and God is one. And that's important because God the Father saves us through Christ by the work of the Spirit. So it comes back to the core of salvation. I think, my personal opinion, and I've no evidence for this other than my personal opinion, is that that's one of the reasons why Wesley didn't include the creeds in the articles of religion which he sent to the church in America. When you put something in a creedal form and make the church say, we believe this, you're forcing people to adopt certain doctrinal formulations which Wesley regarded as fallible human expressions. So I think Wesley would have had although he personally would have agreed with, say, the formulations of the Nicene Creed about Christ as God from God, light from light, etc. I don't think he would have insisted that we all agree on that. Now I'm putting myself in a little bit of a spot here, but I think that he would have said to affirm Christ is divine and human, that's enough. And in fact, in one of his letters to Charles, he comments about the difference between the Monophysites and the Nestorian box in the Eastern Church, and he kind of comments, says, nobody understands what they're talking about anyway, but this has divided the church. And I think this is the key. He's saying these fine doctrinal distinctions are not that important. The closer something gets to the center, the more important it becomes. So when we talk about, he insists the importance of justification by faith, but even there he recognizes differences. Importance of affirming that we are transformed by the power of the Spirit. But there he's prepared to recognize differences of formulation. But as we move away from that center, so the doctrines become less important. He's very critical of the Calvinists because he saw their theology of election as undermining the fundamental point of God's love for human beings and God's love for all human beings. And interestingly enough, although perhaps theologically we might seem closer aligned to the Calvinists, he regards their views as more absurd than that of the Roman Catholics, whom he was very different from, because he sees closer understanding, better understanding of salvation. That also is true when it comes to dealing with ethical issues. That's why I said, talked about this notion of eating meat that has blood in it. But Wesley, that's biblical, it's scriptural, it's apostolic, it belongs to the primitive church, but it's not an issue to fight about. But what is an issue to fight about, interestingly enough, is whether or not you should drink alcohol or spirits, distilled liquor. And the question there is not because he had a problem with distilled liquor. The problem was that the way the liquor industry in Britain at the time was complicit in, distilled gin in particular become the drug of the poor, and people's lives and families would have been destroyed by alcoholism. And Wesley's solution was, don't drink alcohol because it's destroying people's lives. Later, this became a fetish within Methodists that we don't drink alcohol, and lost the point. The point was about that alcohol is destructive to people's lives. And people are making money out of a product that destroys people's lives. Therefore, it's incompatible with the love for our fellow human beings. So yeah, he has an issue which isn't even mentioned in the Bible. I mean, well, distilled alcohol hadn't been invented at that stage, but Wesley's very strong on it. Or slavery. Wesley comes out, particularly at the end of his life, middle of his life, not so much, but at the end of his life, he comes out very strongly against slavery. And I mean, at the best, the Bible is ambiguous about slavery. Let's be honest. It's ambiguous. But Wesley says, in the end, slavery is incompatible with the core of Christian faith, because it's incompatible with loving our neighbors. So even when we can find evidence in the Bible, that doesn't really matter because it's incompatible with loving our neighbors. So Wesley is saying there are certain things which are core things, certain things which we shouldn't be compromising on. There are those which are closest to the teachings around the transformation of the human person, and most importantly, of our love for God and our love for our neighbors. When we come to those issues, we need to take a stop and say. And so if we take contemporary issue, for example, in the 20th century, there's this whole movement in the ecumenical movement to say that racism is incompatible with Christian teaching. Now, misquoting the Book of Discipline there, but incompatible with the gospel. Why? Because racism strikes at the core of loving our neighbor. And therefore, no matter how orthodox the rest of your theology is, if you're a racist, you're denying the core of the gospel, in Wesley's terminology. Now, one final point. The foundations we've talked about, the praxis we've talked about, the consequence of this for Wesley is to seek as much unity as possible without violating each other's conscience. So to seek as much unity as possible without violating the conscience of the other, whatever that conscience might be. So he says, look, I can welcome all sorts of people into my Methodist society, but if you can't come, I will welcome you to the Lord's Supper, to the Eucharist. But if you have a conscientious objection to it, then fine, then stay away. I can welcome you even though you haven't been ordained by a bishop. But if you think it's necessary to be ordained by a bishop, fine, that's up to you. So that comes back to this individual responsibility before God and the church's corporate responsibility before God. So to me, the bottom line for a Methodist church is to be as open to all people as much as possible. Our bottom line is we welcome all who've experienced the transforming work of the gospel. We are open to all, relating to all churches where that experience of the transforming work of the Spirit in Christ by the Spirit is taught and expressed. We're open to all churches who manifest love for God and love for their neighbors in their lives. We can work on the doctrinal issues, but that's the core, that's the bottom line. Other churches have difficulties with that. As you know, for example, our discussions with the Episcopal Church, we had lots of debates around the office of the bishops, how we understand communion, whether we use grape juice or wine, and all sorts of things. And those are their problems, not our problems. Because the ground position from a Methodist perspective is where we see God at work in the lives of other people, in the lives of other churches. We can affirm them. We can work with them as much as possible. We might say, yes, we have problems, say baptism. We baptize infants, other churches don't. How do we work a way around that? That's a struggle. That's an issue. But our ground position is we will work with them. And we will seek as much unity as possible without violating conscience. And I've spoken far too long and too much.
No, so David, that was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you very much. And I think we have 7-8 minutes for questions if you would be willing to field them.
I'm happy.
Questions for Dr. Field?
I don't
things. Sorry, go ahead, Marion.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but when you were discussing kind of Wesley's position on certain doctrinal differences, I couldn't help but think about some of the folks who have kind of broken away from our denomination and some of the positions that I heard from some of those folks from a theological perspective is we've gotten too far away from catechism and we're not all on the same page about what our doctrine is. We need to have a stern doctrine here. And that doesn't, based on what you've said, that doesn't sound like that was the essence of what Wesleyanism is. I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but that's something to say. So,
well, let me say I agree with you. I'll just say amen. I think, we hear a lot of talk in some of the groups of left and some others talk about Wesleyan orthodoxy. That's a contradiction. Wesley is strong. I mean, he argued, yes, we are Orthodox. We as Methodists hold these traditional viewpoints about who is God, who is Christ, about salvation by faith, all of that. But they're not the key thing. The key thing is, has God transformed your life? And just to give you an example, and this is so I won't come from another hand, but I recently read an article on holiness by one of the people who used to be part of the United Methodist Church. Name will remain anonymous. He didn't mention, in the article, about 2 or 3 pages, he talked a few times about loving and serving God. There was not a word about loving your neighbor. And the whole emphasis on holiness was on being separate, being different, separate from something. I kind of wanted to scream out, read Wesley! It just kind of missed the point. And I fear many of this understanding that we must have clear doctrine. It's just not in Wesley at all. And we missed the point because and what Wesley notes about this, and this is once you start disagreeing about doctrine, it starts as a kind of intellectual debate, but it soon becomes nasty, and you're calling each other's names, and you're destroying each other, and you're seeking to undermine each other's reputation and their person, and it becomes really bad. And he says, no, that is just the work in Wesley's terms, that's the work of the devil. That we become so involved in orthodoxy, we're actually doing the work of the devil, which is that which disrupts love and community. So, that's why I said it's important to see that in this stream, that this broad narrative of salvation, the work of Christ is to bring love, is to bring community, is to bring people together. When we start pulling apart and destroying each other, in Wesley's understanding, we're doing the work of the devil. It's pretty strong on it.
Thank you for that.
Tess, you're wanting to say something?
Yeah, I was wondering sort of the key resources that you are using to sort of pull on this. Like I know Jean commented the sermon on bigotry, but like the ones in which you think that are more leaning towards unity or show this.
Yeah. The key sermons of the main are the Caution Against Bigotry, the Catholic Spirit. There's the sermon from the funeral of George Whitefield. And then the rest is kind of scattered throughout everything he writes. His sermon on Christ our righteousness, where he talks about justification by faith and how we have different views on that, and the sermon on the Trinity, where again he comes back, he discusses the significance of doctrine. And the other big is his writings on Christian perfection, the sermon on Christian perfection, but particularly the writings, what is it called now? The major piece on Christian perfection, the name goes out of my mind. A Plain Account of Christian Perfection, I think it is, where he deals with precisely the issue of how does Christian perfection mean we know all things correctly? And his whole argument there is that perfection does not mean perfection in knowledge, it's perfection in love. And that, so right at that core understanding of sanctification is this notion that sanctification is about love for others and therefore seeking unity, even though we disagree with each other. And I remember sitting in a meeting of the Commission on the Way Forward a few years ago, and just pleading with people and saying, go read what Wesley says about sanctification. But to my more conservative siblings, and saying, at the heart of what he says about sanctification is unity. At the heart of what he says about sanctification is recognizing we mess up and don't understand things properly. It's the recognition of diversity is at the heart of his doctrine of sanctification, which is the core of what it means to be Methodist. sorry, I get all upset about this because I just, it pains me that we, in the Methodist churches, and it's not just the United Methodist Church, we have become so focused on correct doctrine that we miss the point, and that is love. Now, I know there are difficulties. So I'm going off on a tangent again. I mean, I know there are issues. How does that love become manifest in our lives of our community? And that's where we struggle with. So we struggle with, the inclusion of LGBTQ folk within the church. And how does love manifest that in there? But let's grapple with that as an issue of love, not as an issue of condemning and doctrine and beating each other over the head with it. It's about people. It's about love. There are times when we have to say, love means I must separate from you. I cannot tolerate racism within the church. That must be clear, unambiguous, because racism is a denial of love no matter how much you try to dress it up. Personally, I think discrimination against women in the life of the church is an issue where on the same level as racism. And I think that's why the church ought to be, the Methodist Church takes a strong stand on the full ordination of women in the life of the church. I think to me, that's a fundamental understanding. Now, that gives me problems with my Catholic colleagues and so on, but that's where I stand. I can wrestle with them, but so those are the kinds of things. Yeah.
David, again, thank you. This has been an excellent hour of teaching, and I'm very grateful that you allowed us to record it. And so I will be able to make that recording available to you all, but I think I'll also put it, if it's okay with David, on our YouTube channel where there are lots of different trainings. But this one is just so special because it's just such a good overview. And we greatly thank you for your time and for your intelligence and your teaching. Thank you.
I'll put the notes on I just want to quickly read through them quickly before you do the next piece and just correct the typos, and then I'll stick it in the chat.
Perfect.
So people can have it.
Yeah. Or I can email it if you want as well.
That's okay. I can do it now quickly and put it in the chat, and I can email it, whatever's easiest.